Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is the third part of the economic transformation lecture. So, in the first two, we've covered the Industrial Revolution, the market revolution, the transportation, and communication revolution. So, the communication revolution I spent the least amount of time on just because it deals with faster mail service, faster communication across the ocean, and really the invention of the telegraph. So this last part, I'm going to talk about urbanization and immigration, as well as kind of like some social recreation. What did people do for fun and social settings and so forth during the first half of the 1800s? So in world history, too, we always cover the Industrial Revolution. One of the big effects of the Industrial Revolution, and both the first phase and the second phase, is tremendous growth of cities and towns. We're seeing that play out all the way in the 2000s. They're predicting internationally that by the year, I think it's either 2030 or 2040, that 80% of the world's population will live in an urban or suburban part, and that's because of really starts with Industrial Revolution, but a lot of times the better paying jobs are going to be in the cities. Farmers are going to kind of get fed up at times with the weather and storms and hail and drought and so forth when they can get a consistent wage in the cities, particularly those that were like tenant farmers who didn't own their own land. They weren't yeoman farmers and so forth. A lot of immigrants are going to take industrial wage jobs in cities and towns. So in the course of 20 years between 1820 and 1840, towns with 2,500 citizens went from about 58 to 126. During these 2 decades, the total number of city dwellers grew more than fourfold, from 443,000, this is estimated, to about 1.8 million. Cities were always built along important waterways like Lowell, Massachusetts, Hartford, Connecticut, Trenton, New Jersey, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There's 3 rivers that converge to form the Ohio at Pittsburgh. It used to, the Steelers played at Three Rivers Stadium. Cincinnati, Ohio, New Orleans is where the Mississippi River flows into the Gulf of Mexico. All of these cities grew very rapidly. Most grew because of their close proximity to major transportation routes and junctions, a lot of jobs that went with that. Also, Buffalo, St. Louis, Detroit, and Chicago were transformed as cities due to transportation and their proximity to it. Chicago's merchants and bankers developed the marketing, provisioning, and financial services that were essential to farmers and small-town merchants in the surrounding countryside. The Midwestern commercial hubs quickly became manufacturing centers as well, maximizing the city's location as key junctions for railroad lines and steamboats. Entrepreneurs built rocks, warehouses, flour mills, and packing plants created work for hundreds of artisan and factory laborers. Cyrus McCormick, who invented the grain reaper that was revolutionary for the Industrial Revolution, we covered in the first part of this lecture, he moved his plant from Virginia to Chicago. Basically to be closer to more of his customers in the Midwest and be able to ship them to them quicker and cheaper. Also, by 1860, St. Louis and Chicago had become the nation's third and fourth largest cities, respectively, after New York and Philadelphia. New York City was important as a center of finance. New York City's population quadrupled. I did say that, quadrupled to nearly 1 million between 1820 and 1860. So over a 40-year period, it quadrupled. So it is, that's nuts. Drawing on the abundant supply of labor, New York became a center of small-scale manufacturing and the ready-made clothing industry, which relied on the labor of thousands of low-paid seamstresses. New York's growth stemmed primarily from its dominant position in foreign and domestic trade. It had also the best harbor in the U.S., and thanks to the Erie Canal, was the best gateway to the West for immigrants and manufacturers, because you could just go up the Hudson, cross the Erie Canal, cross Lake Erie, and then you're in the Midwest. Also, it was the best way to ship for manufacturers and also people who are shipping grain from the west to the east. Ocean shipping also continued to be important on the East Coast, and by 1840, the Port of New York handled almost 2/3 of foreign imports into the United States, almost half of all foreign trade, and much of the immigrant traffic. As cities grew, however, so did unsanitary conditions. All right, so let's talk about pop culture. Basically, what are some cultural things that people did for fun? So in rural areas, free time was often spent in communal activities such as barn raisings and corn husking parties, shooting matches, and foot races, while residents of the seacoast sailed and fished. So let me explain what a barn raising is, or a house raising. So let's say that me and my wife got married in our early 20s or something in say the 1830s, and lived in a rural town. to get started out, we try to purchase some land for relatively cheap. Problem is, we don't have a house, and it would take a long time to build it. So the town people would come together, and what they would do is either house raising or barn raising. All the men would, over the course of a couple of days, kind of like the Amish, would build my wife and I a house. And then, in the evening, throughout the day, women would be cooking meals, and you would have this big, huge potluck, and it would be like a big social celebration. It was a big social event. And oftentimes, a lot of people met their future spouse at these house raising or barn raising. Usually, to have a dance at the end of it, kind of like a square dance or something like that. And so it was pretty cool that they got to do that. Corn husking parties. So if you were in a corn growing area, basically shucking corn is a very monotonous, tedious task. But if you're doing it around some of your closest friends in the community and you're socializing as you're doing it, it takes a kind of monotonous job and makes it less boring. Do the same thing for women with sewing parties as well. Shooting matches, having competition who had the best aim with firearms, foot races, horse races. People on the seacoast primarily sailed and fished for recreation. And in colonial cities, people attended balls, went on sleigh rides and picnics, and played parlor games at home. So these were like more the upper class that could afford a billiards table, played cards, played chess. And as far as urban recreation goes, social drinking was very popular during this time, especially among industrial laborers. So alcohol consumption, really in the first half of the 1800s until the second phase industrial revolution, the temperance movement kind of curtailed some of that. It was the highest rates of alcohol consumption in American history. The average American consumed about 7 gallons of liquor a year, and the per volume alcohol content was higher at that time. Drinking taverns or social or sporting clubs in the burgeoning cities serve as the means of recreation and leisure. Also, one of the things that now today this is outlawed, but that a lot of men would attend and bet on was what's called cockfighting and dogfighting. Cockfighting is when you take two male chickens, and because of their aggressive nature, they would have them fight till one of them died, usually, and then people would bet to see whose chicken was going to win. Dogfighting was similar to that with dogs. Boxing was also popular and also drew large crowds, and you'd have betting on that. Usually Irish and Englishmen fought until one couldn't continue, and they were typically bare-knuckled. And some of them actually died fighting in some of these boxing matches. In the performing arts, theaters were very popular, as well as opera houses. They watched anything from Shakespeare's plays to magic shows. Usually young and middle-aged men attended these forms of entertainment. And between the 1830s and 1870s, minstrel shows, which are white people dressed as blacks in plays, were immensely popular throughout the nation, especially among northern working-class ethnic groups and southern whites. And they reinforce racial stereotypes. Okay. Now, both the industrial and market revolutions improved the material lives of many Americans by enabling them to live in larger houses because they could afford them now, cook on iron stoves so they could improve their standard of living with better things to cook on, wear better made clothes. Particularly in the cities, the new economic order led to distinct social classes. A wealthy and industrial commercial elite was one. They were at the top of the upper class. Substantial middle class, thanks to the Industrial Revolution. That's one of the biggest effects of the Industrial Revolution is the growth of the middle class. The fact that after World War II, the United States has 60% of its population in middle class. None of that would have been possible without the Industrial Revolution. Also, a mass of property-less wage earners were at the lower class. Now, I want to show you, this is the population density in 1790. So you can see that the the majority of the American population are living east Appalachians. You have a little bit have gone into western Pennsylvania and a little bit into Ohio and some into Kentucky and a little bit into Tennessee. And then boom, by 1830, now you have more of the population moving west of the Appalachians, and then it's going to increase even more so. And so this flood west is another reason why they want these transportation improvements, these infrastructure funded projects like canals, roads, railroads, so you can get out west easier. You can also ship your goods back to the east to markets a lot easier. And so it lowered your overall cost. You look at American cities in 1820, boom, by 1850, it's increased rapidly, and you see San Francisco and Sacramento even on the map. So let's talk about the changes in social structure with the business elite. In rural areas and in the South, people of different economic classes shared many of the same interests and enjoyed similar discussions despite their economic class differences. This all occurred before the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution shattered agrarian social order and created a fragmented society composed of distinct regions, classes, and culture. All of that is because really of the Industrial Revolution, this new economy, cash crop agriculture in the South with cotton. This new economic system pulled many Americans into large cities, thereby accentuating the differences between rural and urban life. Moreover, it made a few city residents like the merchants, manufacturers, bankers, and landlords who comprise the business elite very rich. The Industrial Revolution created the greatest wealth probably ever accumulated in world history, particularly the second phase of it. So this isn't the first phase. Okay. In 1800, the top 10% of the nation's families owned about 40% of the wealth. But by 1860, the richest 10% owned nearly 70% of the wealth. In big cities, the top 1% own 40% of all tangible property and buildings. So Industrial Revolution creates this tremendous industrial economic class. Also, in an era before federal taxes on individual and corporate income, the U.S. Treasury raised most of its revenue from tariffs, taxes on textiles and other imported goods that were purchased mostly by ordinary citizens. State and local governments also favored the wealthier classes. They usually tax real estate, like farms, city lots, and buildings that you own, and intangible personal property like furniture, tools, and machinery, but almost never tax the stocks and bonds owned by the rich or the inheritance they pass on to their children. The wealthy eventually had luxuries that set them apart from others in cities. They dressed in well-tailored clothes, rode in fancy carriages, and lived in expensively furnished houses tended by butlers, cooks, and other servants. The women no longer socialized with those of lesser wealth, and the men no longer labored side by side with their journeymen. Instead, they became managers and directors and relied on trusted subordinates to issue orders to hundreds of factory operatives. Increasingly, merchants, manufacturers, and bankers searching for privacy chose to live in separate neighborhoods, often at the edge of the city. The reclusiveness of privileged families and a massive flow of immigrants into other districts divided cities geographically along lines of class, race, and ethnicity. Now, the middle class really is the biggest benefactor of the Industrial Revolution. Now, you may be thinking, well, Mr. Gore, you just said all that stuff about all the wealthy and how much they changed. That's true, but that is a much smaller percentage of the population. The middle class affected more people and also benefited much more Americans than just the business elite. And so really, it's incredible how much the growth of the middle class happened. It's going to continue throughout the first phase of the Industrial Revolution. It really is going to continue in the second phase. And we get to the 20th century, look out, especially when we get to that post-war economic boom after World War II, how many Americans are going to be in the middle class. And so it is pretty cool. The middle class won't be able to afford as many of the expensive items and so forth as the business elite, but they are going to be able to afford nicer furniture, a little bit nicer homes, a little bit nicer clothing. Sometimes they could hire domestic servants. Sometimes they couldn't, depend on where in the middle class they were. One of the things that developed at this time was ice boxes that came about to help store their food, so that preserved things. And also, to ensure their success, middle-class parents usually provide their offspring with a high school education in an era when most white children received only 5 years of schooling. They celebrated work as a key to a higher standard of living for the nation and to social mobility for the individual. The self-made man became a central theme of American pop culture, and personal achievement linked the upper middle classes to the new industrial society. And that's kind of interesting. Now, as far as teaching goes, of course, I'm biased towards this because I'm a teacher, is one of the fastest growing professions in this period, and the pay was terrible, but many saw it as a good first job and a way to not to have to farm for a living. Particularly, a lot of women went into teaching as well. Sometimes you would teach for a few years in your early 20s or something like that, and you would move on to something else. Okay. Now, lawyers often start out as teachers and study an attorney as a clerk. So they didn't have a formal law school. You typically would apprentice under like some type of judge or something or another attorney. And there was really no regulations on lawyers or doctors at this time. Anyone could claim to be a doctor without formal training. In fact, there was a funny saying in the early 1800s that if you took all the doctors and threw them in the ocean, the fish would be worse off and the people would be better off because they didn't have a lot of respect for doctors, which is the opposite today. And by 1860, there were about 60,000 physicians, though. Engineers had lots of work available with all the bridges and canals being built. So my brother-in-law is a mechanical engineer, and he has in the past had designed assembly belts and farm equipment and all kind of stuff. But engineering back then and still today is predominantly a male occupation. Now, as far as women's work, women primarily worked in the home. That's going to be the vast majority of women at this time. When they did work, they worked as teachers or nurses, okay, but were paid less than other male professions. They often volunteered for church and reform societies. Now, in 1840, all of the nation's slaves and about half of its native-born free workers were laboring for others. The bottom 10% of white wage earners consisted of casual workers. So these are people that were like hired out, as tenant farmers or hired out for short-term basis. Poor women washed clothes while their husbands and sons carried lumber and bricks for construction projects. They loaded ships, dug out dirt and stones to build canals. A lot of the Irish worked on the Erie Canal. During business depressions, they bore the brunt of unemployment, and even the best of times, their jobs were temporary and dangerous. Other laborers had great security of employment, but few were prospering. All right, so now we've talked about the business elite and the middle class. Let's talk about what lives were like for the poor. Eventually, as cities grew and the population continued to grow, the lower classes were forced to live in overcrowded boarding houses. These are a lot of them single men and women, or in tiny apartments in the basements and attics of old houses. Now, I really cover these tenements in the second half of U.S. history in Module 1, but these tenements are going to start during this time. They were quickly built because they can't build apartments fast enough for the amount of immigrants they have coming. Usually each floor had one ventilation shaft. You still had outhouses that you had to walk to in the middle of the night outside. It reeked. Disease was rampant. You couldn't pay me enough to go live in an urban area at this time, and, especially if you were poor. A lot of times these tenements were just terrible, god-awful smelling. Many wage earners sought solace in alcohol. And so one of the things the temperance movement was trying to combat was they thought that alcohol consumption, if it ended, it would alleviate some poverty because a lot of the poor people spent their money on alcohol when they could at least afford it. Beer and rum had long been standard fare in many American rituals, patriotic ceremonies, work breaks, barn raisings, and games. In the 1820s and 1830s, alcohol consumption had soared to new heights. It had a devastating impact on urban wage earners. So one of the things you see as a result of this increased alcohol consumption is sometimes family abandonment, high rates of alcoholism. It really is terrible. People even drank while they were on the job, which created dangerous machine work. And so factory owners were also favors of prohibition or temperance because they thought it would lead to more workplace safety. Long before the arrival of spirit drinking Irish and beer drinking Germans, immigrants, there were grog shops of almost every block in working class districts. These saloons became focal points of disorder. Unrestrained drinking by young men led to fistfights, brawls, robberies, and the urban police, mostly low-paid watchmen and untrained constables, weren't able to contain the lawlessness. So alcohol did lead to more crime at that time, kind of like drugs lead to more crime in the present day and age. And so alcohol really was a real problem in American society at that time. Now, I'm going to cover the reform movements in a religion and reform lecture and so forth. So we're going to focus on those lectures: temperance reform, so trying to get rid of the sale of alcohol; abolition, also prison and insane asylum reform, okay, and women's rights and education reform. Okay, so all those are going to be addressed in a later lecture. Now let's talk about really the last topic for this lecture, and that is immigration and the backlash towards it. And so if you look at these are all estimated, rounded off numbers, so don't expect these to be exact by any means. But you look at the amount of immigrants that were coming. Look how many come between 1851 and 1855, right before the American Civil War. Tons of immigrants, and guess what? It's going to get even more so after the Civil War. Let's look at the Irish first. The Irish had been coming over before the Irish potato famine, but the Irish potato famine gets a lot of attention in world history and American history because in that time period, so many Irish came all of a sudden. So they've been coming kind of steadily throughout the 1800s. I mean, a lot of them worked on the Erie Canal, but what happened was the potato was a crop, if you remember from the Columbian Exchange, that was not in the Eastern Hemisphere. When it was introduced to Ireland, it did great in their climate, and it also provided a lot of good, nourishing calories for a lot of the poor Irish. The problem is there was a disease that affected potatoes in the 1840s, and people were starving, and so the poorest of the Irish just didn't have the money to get across the ocean. The wealthiest would stay, but it's the ones that were poor, but not the poorest, would spend their life savings, what little they had, just to get across the ocean. So when they arrive in the United States, they can't afford to go west. because they don't have any money for transportation. So they stay in New York, they stay in Boston, they stay in Baltimore, they stay in Philadelphia, because those are the cities that they can find work in. And one of the things that you began seeing is the exploitation of immigrants as well politically. And so you start seeing the Democratic Party create what's called political machines, and later the Republicans are going to do it as well after the Civil War. But what they were is they would recruit Irish from the boat docks and say, "Oh, hey, you're new to our country. Hey, you need to work? Yes. Do you need a place to stay? Yes." So they would find them a job and work in exchange for those party bosses. They would have to vote. Those Irish, once they gained citizenship, would have to vote for whoever they told them to. Otherwise, they would throw them out on the street, get them fired from their job, and so forth. So they exploited the Irish. In fact, you began having these Irish societies that would begin forming to protect Irish from exploitation as well. The Irish also drank very heavily, and so they were kind of looked down upon. And there were definitely problems in the Irish community, but and there was lack of education, and they were very poor. But you'll see within 2 to 3 generations how much more Irish Americans prosper. And I would argue that of all the immigrant groups in American history that have faced persecution, the Chinese get it the worst. The Irish get it the second worst in American history. And really, the reason why I argue that the Chinese got it worse is because it was actually the Chinese Exclusion Act that gets passed after the Civil War that specifically prevented immigrants coming from China. The Irish never had that. Also, you see not only kind of an anti-Irish backlash, you also see kind of an anti-Catholic backlash. And you would see signs that would say no Irish need apply and so forth. You also had these, like I said, one of the organizations that was designed to protect Irish were called the Ancient Order of the Hibernians. And then the Molly Maguires were much more aggressive and violent Irish labor union that actually killed some of the miner owners and kind of resorted to some terrorist activities and so forth. But as time goes along, things are going to improve. In fact, New York's Tammany Hall, which is the most infamous political machine in probably American history, you had Irish people that were in that, and they were exploiting other Irish. Let's talk about the Germans. And so the Germans contain a lot more variety than the Irish. The Irish were primarily poor when they came. Some of the Germans were educated, some were poor. Okay, some were middle class, some were not. Some were Protestant, some were Catholic, some Jewish, some agnostic or atheist. So the Germans had the greatest variety between the two. They migrated in families and moved to more rural areas and were mostly well-trained in a trade. So they had more of a skill, so therefore they could get a better economic prosperity usually. The Germans like to migrate into their own kind of German towns. And so throughout the United States, you will see towns that have German names. For instance, New Braunfels, Texas is a German settlement. Of course, Green Hall was the way it's spelled. It's actually a German pronunciation. Fredericksburg was a German settlement in Texas. A lot of German settlements in Wisconsin, a lot of German settlements in Pennsylvania, and others. And so the Germans were really good at kind of preserving their cultural heritage, where a lot of immigrants would kind of assimilate within about 2 to 3 generations. The Germans you had Germans towns that they didn't learn English for 4, 5, 6 generations, and so forth when they came. So by the end of the century, some 250,000 German Jews had immigrated to the United States. They settled in Illinois, Missouri, Texas, Ohio, and Wisconsin. They often settled in their own communities and developed sharpshooter clubs, fire engine companies, kindergartens, okay, so like little schools, social gatherings with food, beer, and music. They left their homeland to escape economic hardships and also autocratic government, because Germany's not united until the 1870s. The Germans and the Irish are going to be the 2 biggest immigrant groups during this time period. And when they came, they prospered with astonishing ease. So the Germans did better economically than the Irish. And German and Irish immigration to the South, except for Texas, was discouraged because of competition with slave labor. Okay. And then you do come for political reasons. In world history, too, we talk about the democratic revolutions in 1848. They're all suppressed, but a lot of people fled as a result of them. And so here's some of the cool German things: the Kentucky rifle, Christmas tree, okay, kindergarten, and abolitionist. Some of the earliest abolitionists were German immigrants. Now, because that they kind of live in their own distinct communities and they didn't want to assimilate, a lot of native-born Americans were like, what the heck, you know? Also, they drank beer very heavily, culturally, and so forth. So if you look right here at the source of immigration between 1820 and 1840, you can see the Irish made up the largest, German the second most, and you still see a ton of English and other Europeans that were coming as well. As far as the British, Scandinavian, and Chinese, for the British and Scandinavians, they recruited a large number of professionals and independent farmers and skilled workers. Scandinavians flocked to Wisconsin and Minnesota, where they get that accent. While the Chinese primarily went to California because that was where they were going for the gold rush and later to find work on the railroads. Part of the reason why the Chinese, you have to understand push and pull factors for Chinese immigration. What's drawing the Chinese to the West Coast was the availability of jobs and a chance to strike it rich in the gold rush, but really the railroads. They specifically recruited Chinese for the Central Pacific Railroad. Secondly, what is pushing them out was a really nasty rebellion in the 1850s. It's arguably one of the most violent rebellions in world history, and it devastated the Chinese countryside. And so a lot of them it's kind of like a religious cult rebellion that takes place that we cover in world history too. But they flee that to escape and come to the United States as well. Unfortunately, women were recruited and exploited from China. That they'd be told by these Chinese merchants, "Hey, we're recruiting you for domestic servants or to be maids for these wealthy families in California." And then when we get there to the United States, they'd be forced into prostitution. It was sex trafficking, and it was terrible. You look at immigration between, so this is 1820, 1840. You look at it, and now you have more others, the 10%, and say one of the reasons why you have that change is because you have the Chinese coming. Okay. So let's talk about the nativist backlash. So many people feared this influx of Catholic immigrants and thought they would take over the country. Samuel Morse, the inventor of the telegraph, particularly was a big nativist. In 1834, he published A Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States, which warned of a Catholic threat to American republic institutions. The social tension stemming from industrialization also intensified anti-Catholic sentiment. During bad economic times, mob formed to attack Catholics, claiming they took their jobs. These cultural conflicts inhibited creation of a unified labor movement. Some Protestants organized nativist clubs, which called for limits on immigration, the restriction of public office to native-born citizens, and exclusive use of the Protestant version of the Bible in public schools. In fact, there was what's called the Bible riots in Philadelphia about which version of the Bible they were going to use in the schools. Now, in the 1950s, Bibles can't be used necessarily to be taught out of in public schools because of the Supreme Court case. But at that time, all schools primarily used the Bible. And so the question, are you going to use the Protestant Bible or the Catholic Bible? It led to fights in the streets in Philadelphia called the Bible riots. Benevolent-minded Protestant reformers supported the anti-Catholic movement for reasons of public policy. Since nearly all Irish drank, temperance reformers condemned the rowdiness of drunken Irishmen. Now, the alcoholism in the Irish community was pretty bad. The backlash that they received is not really justified, but there was definitely issues in the Irish community with alcoholism at that time that really need to be addressed by society. Education reformers opposed the diversion of tax resources to Catholic schools. In many northeastern cities, religious and cultural conflicts led to violence, and violence is never really justified. And in 1834, a riot broke out between Protestants and Catholics in Charlestown, Massachusetts, which was a suburb of Boston, and so forth. Even as economic revolution brought prosperity to many Americans and attracted millions of immigrants, it divided the society along the lines of class, ethnicity, and religion. And there was even this group called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner that formed to stop and prevent Irish immigrations particularly. So you want to star and highlight or underline the Star-Spangled Banner movement. But that's what develops into the Know Nothing Party, or they call themselves the American Party, but they would meet in secret. And so when people ask, "Hey, where'd you go?" Like, "Oh, I don't know anything." They would try to meet in these secret meetings and so forth. And we are done with the economic transformation lecture.